This video series is to expand on why people choose not to identify with feminism. The hope is to find the alternative or popular argument among feminists. I mean, since feminism has such a vast array of opinions, let's begin. To start, let's look at what feminists are saying that toxic masculinity is. It refers to the socially constructed attitudes that describe the masculine gender role as violent, unemotional, sexually aggressive, and so forth. Interesting, except no one is saying that you have to be those things to be a man, and being unemotional isn't necessarily toxic. What else?
Now let's be clear, masculinity is not inherently a bad thing. What's bad is when society tells us that being a man means things like strength and power at the expense of being allowed to really feel things.
Right, and where is this society that feminists speak of that are telling all these men not to feel things, and if they do, they aren't real men? What else?
First up is toxic masculinity, which is a phrase that refers to all of the negative aspects of our culture's definition of masculinity.
Not only is that a super vague definition, there is some major subjectivity there too, as how do you objectively measure negative forms of masculinity? Many forms that may be considered negative can be positive too. Aggression, for example. It can be used in sales to close the deal, or in sports. While there is the negative aspect, we don't call it toxic femininity when a woman feels aggression. Does it get worse?
There have been 71 mass murders in the US since 1982, and 70 of them were carried out by men. Most of those are white men. This is not a coincidence. It's telling us something about our culture. Elliot hated the fact that other men were having sex when he wasn't, and he ultimately killed him to prove that he was the true alpha male.
This has nothing to do with masculinity. Just because a man is violent doesn't mean he was taught to be violent to prove his masculinity. The implied assertion here is that if only we would have taught Elliot here that you don't need to be sexually aggressive to be considered a man, he wouldn't have killed those people. So instead of blaming the man, we will blame masculinity. If culture was to blame for this, the mass murder rate would be quite a bit higher than it is. What if we bring gender studies courses into it? Let's not use extremists now.
In our textbook for my class, Gender and Communication, in the first chapter they talk about violence as an institution, and it says that systems or social structures maintain the notion that being violent, whether in the case of war or seemingly benign verbal bullying, is a legitimate part of heterosexual masculinity, so much so that violence becomes a normalized, accepted behavior for men. Predominant expectations of masculinity tend to enable men to dominate other men, women, children, animals, and their environment.
Even the feminist courses in schools are saying society is trying to teach men to be violent. No real-world examples of institutions teaching men to be violent, only assertions that it is true. While I can see why feminism may be appealing to some people, as their incredibly vague definitions of things make it very hard to debate, making it very easy to label whatever you personally have a problem with as toxic. They think because a man is violent, that it must be society teaching them to be violent. They think because a man may be aggressive, that society is teaching them to be aggressive. If a man wants a bunch of sex, well, that's just society telling them that they need a bunch of sex. And in turn, in some way, we don't have the freedom to reject these ideas that are supposedly forced on us by society, and need feminism in order to deal with these issues. And you don't see how this is demeaning to men. And if a man is any of those things, he is somehow damaged or toxic? And this is being taught in college courses as a legitimate theory? Wow. I think we see the visible argument here and exactly why feminist ideology has a disdain for men under the guise of, we don't hate you, we just hate what you are, so we are here to tell you that you don't have to be those things. Duh. The things feminists attribute to masculinity are oftentimes hasty generalizations and have nothing to do with masculinity. In fact, I would argue that most of society would call that man a coward for child abandonment, the opposite of masculinity, or attributing something that isn't necessarily toxic at all. On top of this, when men want to discuss their issues or bring up issues men face, feminists break out the male tears cups or say, "Program for women and maybe one for men." Not that I care, I just find it ironic how hypocritical it is to see men can express emotion too, while in the same instance drink our tears. The reality of it is we do not need to be rescued from our masculinity. There is no secret guide code out there teaching men how to be real men by society, and masculinity isn't some disease that needs to be cured, and we certainly don't need to be dividing up human traits between the sexes. Now for the visible argument. Where's the visible discussion within the feminist movement trying to get this talking point removed, or at least in the spirit of equality, call undesirable female traits toxic femininity? Never do feminists ever seem to talk about are the positives of masculinity like they do with femininity. leading outsiders looking in to believe that masculinity is something to be criticized and deemed as toxic, and femininity is something to be praised and deemed as wholesome. Not even close to balanced. When a woman drowns her child, we don't say it was due to toxic femininity and society must have taught her to be that way. Talk about your lack of equality. Or maybe there is a huge discussion about this within feminist circles.